Sound the alarms, light the beacons, do whatever you do. The trade sounds are coming. Caris LeVert has been dealt from the Pacers to the Cavs right before the Pacers play the Cavs. Lots to talk about with this trade, why the Pacers did it. Is it good or bad value? What does it mean for the Pacers? What does Ricky Rubio mean for the Pacers? Where are the Pacers headed? Holy cow, this is going to be a great podcast. You don't want to miss it.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the West Side Community News. And light the beacons, sound the alarms, do whatever you do. When a Woj bomb comes in, the trade has happened. The first step of whatever the Pacers are doing this week has happened on Sunday. The Pacers traded Caris LeVert to the Cleveland Cavaliers. That is obviously the focus of all of today's podcast. I was going to do stuff on the two Pacers games this weekend. They lost to the Bulls and Cavs as expected. They signed Reggie Perry. Can't even talk about that. Caris LeVert gets traded to the Cavs while the Pacers are in the building to play the Cavs. We're going to break it all down, why the Pacers did it. Is it good value? What's next for the Pacers? What they can do with Ricky Rubio? What are the cap impacts? What's going to happen on the court? It's a huge trade. There's a lot to think about from the Pacers' perspective as they do something like this. So let's just take a deep breath and zoom out first. What happened? What, if you haven't heard yet, what is the deal? The Pacers are trading Caris LeVert to the Cleveland Cavaliers for Ricky Rubio, a first-round pick, and 2 second-round picks. Actually, on top of that, Woj reporting, Adrian Wojnarowski had the full trade. On top of LeVert, the Pacers are sending the Miami Heat's second-round pick this season. And then the Cavs are sending their own first-round pick, lottery protected. They are currently slated to be picking 25th, which is pretty late, but it's still a first-round pick. And then the Rockets' second-round pick, which is 33rd, third pick in the second round, and as well as a 2027 Jazz second. I can talk more about that in the future if I need to. Doesn't matter. And then the Pacers sent the Heat's second-rounder from the season. That's the fourth to last pick in this draft on top of LeVert. That is all the moving parts. So on top of the Pacers fans who are rooting for the tank to get high, the Pacers fifth in the draft lotto odds right now. Pacers fans can now root against the Cavs to fall in the second round. That is the full trade. Ricky Rubio is just in there for salary. He's out for the season with a torn ACL. We'll talk about him later. Let's talk about this deal. My initial reaction was this. So let's back up, actually, before we do initial reactions. There was some reporting that the Pacers wanted 2 first-round picks for LeVert on this show on Locked On Cavs. Ironically, on Locked On Cavs, we discussed this exact trade about 6 days ago, if you want to go hear that. But we all said in that conversation that 2 firsts for LeVert felt a little high. But what this is, the Pacers give up a crappy second, get a meaningless future 2027 second, and then also they get a first, and then they get pick 33, which is very close to a first. It's only 3 spots out. The difference between pick 30 and 33 isn't that big. So the Pacers get close to the first isn't that good right now. We'll see where the Cavs end up. But the Pacers get close to getting 2 firsts for LeVert. That's kind of what they wanted, which is a little more than I actually thought they would get. So in a vacuum, to me, this trade is fine value, I would say. This is about what LeVert is worth. If you go back in time, the Pacers got him in 2 seconds for Victor Oladipo last year, and a lot of the talk about Oladipo's value was about that, a late first and filler or whatever. So to get that late first a year later and something else, pretty good business from the Pacers. In fact, the trickle down from the Depot trade, the Pacers look fantastic because the Rockets did not get very much for him when they traded him, Oladipo, to Miami, but the Pacers got the year of LeVert plus the back end value of this first and 2 seconds from the Cavs. So I think it's fair value about even in a vacuum, right? It's about what Caris LeVert is worth. Valuable offensive player, good scorer, good setup man. When he's thinking about it, his defense is good. When he's engaged on the end of the floor, we've all seen Caris for the last 400 days on the Pacers. But I keep saying in a vacuum for a reason. Trades are not made in a vacuum. Not all teams are just floating in nebulous space and being 500 and swapping the pieces around. Trades are made given your exact situation. And that is where this trade rocks kind of for both teams, right? The Cavs, we just saw Pacers Cavs, so it's very easy to talk about their situation. Like Brandon Goodwin was starting at point guard for them because Darius Garland's hurt, but Colin Sexton's hurt as well. Lamar Stevens, Rajon Rondo are their backup guards, right? They don't have the best guard rotation, ball handling rotation. They're one of the worst driving teams in the league. So in general, they need someone who can provide a rim punch and be a self-sufficient creator when Garland's not in the game. LeVert can be that for them. So he has more value to their team than a lot of teams because they're good and they need someone who can attack the basket. And the Pacers, this is not a vacuum trade for them because they stink, right? They just lost to the Cavs and fell to 19-36. I predicted the Pacers would finish 500 this year, which was sort of seen as pessimistic before the season. They would have to finish 22-5 in their last 27 games for that to happen now. They stink. They're bad. And LeVert not fitting very well on the team since he got here has been a part of that issue. We've talked about that on this podcast time and time again, is that he is talented. And when he and Sabonis are on the court together, they fit well, and he fits in partnerships with various players. But the Pacers in general, when their full roster has been playing together since they acquired LeVert, it just hasn't fit. It has not worked at all. And the idea was good, and the execution has just not worked. LeVert did not fit on this team, and they're bad. They were a team, unlike the Cavs, who needed a valuable guard wing who can attack and create his own shot. The Pacers needed future assets. They needed to think big picture and not just tread water and run on the treadmill of mediocrity. So they needed assets, and getting a first and a high second and another future second is exactly what they should be doing for Caris LeVert. So I think this is a good, very good trade for both teams. ESPN's grades were CC plus for the Cavs is from Kevin Pelton and an A for the Pacers. I agree. I think the Pacers probably get like an A minus for me. Honestly, it's hard to say what would make it a little better, other than just getting maybe a little bit better of a first round pick. Although who knows where the Cavs end up? They're 25th pick right now, but I'd give the Cavs a little bump from that. In general, though, a very good trade for both teams, and the Pacers needed to do this. They really, I mean, LeVert, of the guys that they were going to trade, I thought a Turner trade might be a little more likely, and we'll see what happens in the coming days. But it felt likely he'd be dealt. He just didn't fit. Like on the team they had before LeVert, I always talk about how this is the same roster as the one, basically the same roster as the one that got fourth in the East in 2019-20. The biggest difference is Depot's gone and LeVert is in. And LeVert just hasn't fit with this team since he returned. Their record with him in games over the last two seasons is not that, doesn't reflect necessarily a guy who is some franchise changer or is like the perfect fit on your team, even though he's talented. And in the games where last year, remember the last 10 games of 2020-21, when he was the guy, he was the offensive threat for them. They had Sabonis and LeVert, and that's it. His stats were unbelievable, right? He's shown that he can do that. But that it just isn't reflective of what he ended up being for this Pacers team. And when they had their full roster, things just didn't go as well for him. So it made sense for them to sell him off. Getting those picks are good, right? We just saw what the Pacers can do with a high second. They used that to trade up for Isaiah Jackson. A first-round pick is obviously a first-round pick. This is only 3 picks behind where they picked Isaiah Jackson. These are the kind of assets that the Pacers need. And LeVert, obviously, again, just didn't fit. So it makes all the sense in the world. And this, my last point about my reaction to the trade is, what this did pretty well for the Pacers is it allowed them to pick a path forward. And I talked about, and I wrote about this in my column about the Pacers at the trade deadline for Forbes. They needed to pick a direction going forward, right? How are they going to build? Do they need to be a rebuilding team? Do they need to be a cap space team? What are they going to do? This trade kind of allows them to be both a rebuilding and a cap space team because Rubio's contract expires after the season. And I'll talk all about Rubio in a minute, but because of that, they could get a lot of cap space this summer, and they got draft picks inserted into their team. They don't necessarily, they're still picking a direction. They're clearly now rebuilding more than they were 7 hours ago. But this allows them to kind of use draft night as more of a leaping off point too of directionality for them. And it clearly makes them worse for the rest of the season, which does cement their rebuilding direction. But they now can be a cap space team that tries to get a little better or continue to go down this path of rebuild, retool, whatever you want to say. So this makes all the sense in the world for both teams to me. And it was funny that it coincided with them literally playing each other. James Boyd in the Indy Star writes that he saw LeVert in the hallway, walking from locker room to locker room and seeing Chris Duarte in the hallway. But this is the number to me that this trade came down to. The record, 33-41. That is the record the Pacers had when LeVert played in any game, played at all, over the last 2 seasons. It's not bad. It's a little below 500. That would have been a play-in team in the East the last 2 seasons, but the Pacers don't want to be a play-in team. They want to be better than that. And to be better than that, they actually need to get worse because 33-41 isn't good enough for what they're paying for the other talent that they have. They needed to find a way to get better than that. And a better way would be developing your young talent, getting more young talent, and making the next great Pacers team instead of just kicking the tires on a team that, when LeVert plays, is 33-41. So that's why they did it. I think the return is good given where both teams are at. And now the Pacers can continue to rebuild, continue to find the next steps toward their next good team. And there's still a lot to talk about with this trade, and we will get right to that. But first, guys, I got to talk about the good folks over at Built Bar who can help you rebuild your body. They're making the healthiest protein bars on the market that are also 100% covered in chocolate, delicious. And I just got to tell you, I love them, and I fit that rebuild line right into this ad read without it being on there. So please try them just for that. It's the time of year that you might have given up on your New Year's resolutions, but don't. Stick to it with healthy Built Bars, 100% covered in chocolate, protein bars that are actually delicious. Most of them contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein, all much better stats than typical candy bars, but they taste just as good. So many listeners to this podcast have tried them and told me they like them. You should be the next one. They're absolutely delicious. Go to Built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your order of Built Bars. You got to try them. Promo code, again, LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thank you for making Locked On Pacers your first listen every day as we dive into trade numero uno of the Pacers rebuild. Caris LeVert to the Cavs for a first-round pick, 2 second-round picks, and Ricky Rubio. We'll get to Rubio in a second. What does this mean for the Pacers on the court is something I want to talk about because, this is obviously a rebuilding move, and they're worse for this. They traded Caris LeVert, who started a lot for them this year. A lot, 40 times. 39 times, excuse me. Almost half their games he would have started this season. He would have made it to 41 if he got to the deadline exactly. Right, basically half the season, LeVert was a starter for this Pacers team. They traded him for a guy who's not going to play at all. This is like last year. They traded Depot for LeVert and then had 2 months without LeVert, and they took a big nosedive, right? Except this time they don't care about that free fall. Like last year they cared and it mattered. This year it doesn't matter as much. So they're going to be worse. It's just obvious. They just played the Cavs. They scored 85 points. Cavs are a good defensive team. You should not only score 85 points. Pacers shot 37% from the field, 26% from deep. Couldn't get up many free throws. Turned it over a bunch. Sabonis couldn't play that much as he returned. There's so many things I can't even talk about that happened from the Pacers this weekend because of this trade. Sabonis returned, couldn't play that much, right? They just don't have creators. No McConnell, no Brogdon, no LeVert. Not enough Sabonis. They don't have shot creators at all, right? Kiefer Sykes started at point guard. Kiefer Sykes had 3 assists. So Sabonis led the way in assists with 4. They just don't have the creators with LeVert not playing. Lance has been a reliable creator off the bench at times, only 2 assists for him in this game. And this is just one game, but it's reflective of what's going to happen to the Pacers. The Pacers' offensive rating with Caris LeVert on the court this season is 118.8. That's all right. It's not awesome. It's not terrible, but it's fine. With him off the court, it drops to 106.6. Pacers offense is over 5 points per 100 possessions better with LeVert in the game. A 111.8 offensive rating with him on, for reference, is about 7th or 8th in the NBA for a team. And they can't sustain that for a whole game, but still. 106.6 with him off would be 28th, right? So he is the difference between being a top 7 offense to being one of the worst offenses in the league. So the Pacers offense is going to be much worse. They are going to be potentially unwatchably bad on offense going forward without Brogdon, without McConnell. Who knows when Brogdon will return? Who knows what other guys can get better? And there are some benefits on the court that I'll get to in a second, but their offense is going to stink. He has been a big carrier of what they've been able to do in that end. Now, the flip side, on defense, the Pacers are probably going to be much better. With LeVert on the floor this season, 112.7 defensive rating. That is atrocious. He is a big reason their defense has sucked this season, was worse in the NBA in the month of January. A 112.7 defensive rating would be 27th in the NBA with LeVert on. With him off, 109.6. That would be 14th in the NBA. So they go from one of the worst defenses in the league to above average when LeVert's not in the game. So the Pacers' defense might get better without him in the coming weeks. We'll see what that actually translates to and things like that. It will allow them to play better defenders too in general. So on the court, look, you can see the difference between those numbers. They're about 2 points per 100 possessions better when he plays. Caris LeVert is obviously a positive for this Pacers team. They're going to be worse, and I just laid those numbers out. But it's not without benefit in general, right? Obviously, the numbers bear out what can happen on the court. But the big benefit for the Pacers has nothing to do with LeVert himself. The big benefit for the Pacers is now Duarte and Dwayne Washington can play every minute at two guard for the rest of the season. And maybe they get someone else in the door in a different trade that they would like to squeeze in at two guard, or maybe they want to squeeze Lance in at two guard at some point when McConnell and Brogdon return this year. If they do, whatever's going to happen, they can now much better optimize their shooting guard minutes. Duarte just played 36 minutes against the Cavs in the first game without LeVert. He had 22 points and 5 rebounds, was easily their best offensive player, was their only guy over 20 points. Dwayne Washington came off the bench, played 31 minutes. That was the Pacers' second most minutes behind Duarte. He had 17 points in this game, has proven to be a reliable three-point shooter and quick decision maker. He was their only guy besides Chris Duarte to score more than 10 points in this game. This game that just got played was like the perfect description of what may be the Pacers for a while. They let up less than 100 points. They played pretty good defense for a lot of the game. Their offense was junk because they didn't have any creators. But Duarte and Washington looked nice and got more opportunity to be featured. Something else interesting in this game that I'll probably talk about on future shows, by the way, that's worth monitoring. Jeremy Lamb, 0 minutes. Interesting with the deadline coming up. But anyway, that is one benefit of this LeVert trade that I think is kind of being under-discussed is, and not even really under-discussed, but Duarte and Washington can now just play all the time going forward. There's no reason that Duarte should not play 30, 32, 36 minutes every game. Just pick a big number. Just hammer him into the ground, get him the reps, get him better. I mean, this is a great opportunity for him now. And freeing up LeVert's playing time now allows them to play the perfect number of guards every single game. So that's what's going to happen on the court for the Pacers. You know who's not going to be on the court for the Pacers? This quick little pivot. Ricky Rubio, who the Pacers got in this trade. And clearly that's not being discussed at all for a reason. He's out for the season. And the part of the benefit of Rubio here is his contract is expiring. $17.8 million this season. LeVert, on the other hand, $17.5 million on his deal this season. It's very confusing, but $300,000 more on the Pacers books. That's not fun for them. They're closer to the tax, but they're not going to pay the tax this year. They'll find a way out of it if they end up getting over it, but they're not even over it still. But the difference is LeVert next year had almost $19 million, and Ricky Rubio costs $0. On YouTube, you can see me holding up below $0. So the Pacers could free up some cap space in this deal, which is an extra bonus. Talk about future impact in the last segment here. Let's talk about Rubio options first, because this is something that is being under-discussed about Ricky Rubio. He can be traded from the Pacers. They could trade him by himself away in the next 3 days. And he has no value. He's an expiring contract on a torn ACL. He was just salary filler in this trade. But now, remember, last week when I talked about creative trades, you can find a way to stick Ricky Rubio in some other big deal to take back big money, or throw him in a trade exception, or trade him for other crappy salary to bring back some assets. It's very unlikely to me that they trade him to somewhere else and reroute him in this process, but it's not impossible that the Pacers can find a way to use Ricky Rubio as a trade thing. They might not even have him report to Indy in the next 4 days. So that's the first thing with Rubio I wanted to talk about is it is legal for them to retrade him in certain ways, not every way. They can't just immediately flip him, but there are legal ways to trade him without aggregating his salary and things like that. So that's why the next 4 days, I'll be interested to see what happens with Ricky Rubio's deal. Here's the thing. He's not going to play the rest of the season. So it's not crazy to me that we get to Friday, trade deadline's passed, and the Pacers just cut him right away. I doubt they'll buy him out because Ricky Rubio can't make up the money somewhere else, but he's not going to play for them. If they want to free up a roster spot to sign someone younger who could play for them this year, it's not crazy that if he's not traded again, they just cut Ricky Rubio on Friday. What's the point of having him on your team? And so something I talked about when the Pacers signed Lance last week is, well, hey, they might have to cut Kiefer Sykes now if they want to clear a roster spot in a 2-for-1 trade. No longer. Now they would cut Ricky Rubio. So Kiefer Sykes is actually a winner from this trade a little bit as well. His roster spot's a little more secure. Something else noteworthy about Ricky Rubio is his torn ACL means he's out for the season. The Cavs applied for a disabled player exception, which you can get if a player is deemed out for the season on your team. And I'm going to search for the exact number while I'm talking, but the Pacers could that DPE does not come with Rubio to the Pacers, but the Pacers could apply for it and get it if they wanted. I think it was like $8 million. Yeah, $8.9 million traded player exception the Pacers got for Rubio. It was only 4 days ago it was granted for him. So the Pacers could apply themselves and get that. Now, the problem is if they use it and pay a player that money, they will go over the tax. So they might apply for it and just never use it, but why not have it? So if Rubio does last on the team past the deadline, a reason the Pacers might not waive him is to get this $8 million salary tool to add a player and not hard cap themselves. So if they don't clear enough money, it's completely pointless, but it's another tool to have. That's another thing about Rubio that's interesting here is it could allow them to do something else. Whether that's, again, like I said, trade him again, get the DPE. Maybe they just waive him for a roster spot to sign another young guy. I don't know, but he isn't like valueless in their planning to have that spot kind of known as, okay, this is a dead spot. What can we do with this? And then the final factor with him is he is an expiring deal, but they could use him in a sign and trade, and keeping his cap hold this summer might be worth it. I'll talk about that in the final segment, but that's something to consider for them this summer is they have his bird rights now, and there's only about 5 teams in the NBA this summer, and Pacers could be one of them now after this trade, that will have significant cap space. So if you're Ricky Rubio, sign and trade might be your best way to get the money you are worth on the trade market. Now, coming off a torn ACL, it's not exactly clear what he's worth or who would want him or anything like that. Pacers have to take back money in that trade, whatever. But Rubio does have value in that he could be signed and traded as well, a la McDermott this past summer, for example. And they don't have that crazy far apart of values to me. So Ricky Rubio, very unlikely he ever plays a game in a Pacers jersey, even next year. Like, there was rumors that they liked him before they could pivot to Brogdon. In fact, they were really close to bringing him in. But he's not going to play for them this year. They don't need an old backup point guard next year. He probably will never play for the Pacers, but he's not valueless to them right now. He could be traded. He could be a part of, getting a disabled player exception. He could just be used as a salary slot to bring, or a roster spot to bring in someone else. He could be signed traded in the summer. His value is extremely low, but it's not zero. So don't just write him off in this. And we might be saying his name again in coming days. We might be saying Ricky Rubio's name again as a guy who the Pacers could trade. Add him to the list of tradable players for the Pacers. So speaking of tradable players for the Pacers, what does LeVert's trade signal about the rest of the trades the Pacers could make? I mean, it's not just, again, none of this stuff happens in a vacuum, despite how often that phrase is used. Let's pivot and talk about what this means for the Pacers going forward. But before we do that, let's talk about the great people over at BetOnline, who have you covered this season with more props, more odds, and more lines than ever before. As football continues its march through the playoffs, right to the big game coming up, the Super Bowl, in less than a week. Can you believe it? And betonline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, sports podcasts, and sports news this season. It's not just football. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. So don't wait to take advantage of all the new amazing offers available for the 2022 season. Head over to betonline.net where the game starts. Thank you guys so much for always making Locked On Pacers your first listen every day. Let me know on Twitter at TEastNBA if there's an element of this trade you think I did not cover enough or that you would like to know more about. We'll talk about the salary cap here in a moment because I know people are very interested in what the Pacers' new cap impact is. I talked about it a little bit in the last segment, but what does this trade signal about what the Pacers are doing? This is the first thing. If the Pacers had come to this deadline and their first trade was Justin Holiday or Torrey Craig for a couple seconds, you could have said that doesn't signal anything. They could still keep their vets and try to be good next season. Trading away Caris LeVert is a pretty seismic deal. I mean, he has kind of earned his rep as a pretty heavily injured player. But a lot of the percentages of the games he's missed since joining the Pacers were from the cancer diagnosis. I mean, after he returned last season, he missed one game. It was their third to last game of the season against the Bucks. And then this year, he had the back thing bugging him for the first 2 weeks of the season. But since that first 2 week span ended, and really since the 6th game of the season, so 9-day span ended, he has missed less than 10 games. He missed 8 games, right? LeVert is not that injured. I think that rep was sort of wrong for him. All that to say, he is a significant piece of the Pacers, and trading him away certainly signals everything we need to know about what the Pacers are thinking about doing the rest of this week. They are rebuilding. They are retooling. They are not proceeding with a goal of being awesome this year. Rubio's not playing for them. If they had traded Caris LeVert for similar assets, but also gotten a decent player in return for him, I would have maybe thought that they were trying to continue to be at least somewhat credibly good this year. Trading away LeVert for no good player in return and all picks, that signals everything you know about what the Pacers are doing. They are clearly rebuilding now. I think that makes a Turner trade more likely. I think that makes a Sabonis trade potentially even more likely. That makes a Justin Holiday and or Torrey Craig trade significantly more likely, I would say. That makes a Jeremy Lamb trade more likely. Anyone who is older than 25, much more likely. And the two centers who are exactly 25, 26, a little more likely, I think. Because what's the point now? Especially with Turner, especially with Holiday, especially with Craig, who become expiring contracts after the deadline, basically. And then their value diminishes quite a bit in terms of trades. Yeah, it makes all the sense in the world that they would be dealt now. So it makes it more likely to me that the Pacers are going to do more stuff. This signals to me they are in a rebuilding mode. They know they need to be getting future pieces. They can even use those future pieces in other trades potentially in the future, but they are clearly tearing down what they have right now. They maybe aren't trying to like tank or anything, but they're trying to turn their assets to the future, and they will still try to win their games in the meantime. I think that was sort of obviously their plan anyway. When you only have 19 wins at the end of January, that's what you do. But they're actually doing it. They took an action. Actions are always louder than words, and this is an action. This is the most significant Pacers trade. I mean, the Depot was a big significant trade, but they needed to trade Depot at some point. They didn't have to trade Caris LeVert this season. This is the first Pacers choice, really. That's the wrong way of saying it, but this is the most autonomy they've had. How about that? To trade a mid-season that they've ever had, and in the Pritchard era, and they did it. And I think that clearly signals that they are rebuilding. You know, Depot, he didn't demand a trade necessarily, but it was clear he had eyes for other teams and was on an expiring deal. The Pacers were going to move him that year. Caris, they did not have to move this year. They could have done it next year. They could have done it another time. They could have tried to continue to be good this year despite it not working. They did it. The Pacers actually dealt him. That, to me, signals they are rebuilding. They are clearly going to get future pieces, or maybe even just pieces for next year on their team. And this year's about development now. So that is what this signals right now. But also what this signals is they might be looking to be an interesting player in 2022 free agency. Now, I'll have to talk about this in more detail in a future segment because this could be an entire show about dorky stuff. But remember when I had a crossover with Ryland Styles of Locked On Thunder, how the Thunder were over the cap but under the salary floor? The Pacers could be an interestingly similar team this summer where they have a Doug McDermott trade exception, a Victor Oladipo trade exception, an Aaron Holiday trade exception, and a cap hold for the mid-level exception in TJ Warren. They could be a team that has a bunch of cap space but is also over the cap and can decide to go a bunch of routes this summer. They could decide to spend the MLE and then bring a guy in on the McDermott trade exception and sign and trade Ricky Rubio and remain over the cap and still get a bunch of pieces and have all these trade exceptions and continue to kind of, I think that would be more of a rebuilding path, but rebuild for another year. They could also say, screw all that. If you go under the cap, you lose your trade exceptions, who cares? We'll sign someone good and try to run it back and be good next year. And the reason I don't want to get too into the cap nitty-gritty right now is because it could all change substantially in the next 2 or 3 days. If the Pacers trade a couple more vets, their cap situation changes next year. So it's not worth saying, well, this is what they should or shouldn't do or what they can and can't do in the coming summer. But they now have, and I'm stealing this line from someone I was DMing who I trust about the salary cap. I won't say their name unless they allow me to say their name on a podcast in the future. I'm sure they're listening. This allows the Pacers to take what the market gives them now, a little bit more, both now and in the offseason as they look kind of at their moves, because they have the option to be an over the cap team or an under the cap team. They have an option to be, like I said earlier, when they made the move, because they got picks and space, they can kind of be a little more loosey-goosey about if they're trying to really bottom out right now or just make it a draft night kind of decision deal where they focus on what kind of team they want to be in the free agency period. They can take what they're given now a little more. They don't have to focus on either space or picks or prospects or whatever. They can kind of evaluate a little easier what is literally the best offer we have. They're a little more now free in that way, and that in their very first trade, they were able to accomplish both goals of getting under the cap for 2022 and bringing in picks and prospects potentially. So the Pacers can now take what the market gives them a little easier, and I'll do the full salary cap impact once the deadline is over, but they will have significantly more space. They could at least have significantly more space than they did before this trade happened. So I think it's a good deal for the Pacers for a million reasons, but I think that might be beyond getting assets for a guy who, again, wasn't providing you a ton of wins, 33 and 41 when he plays as the number. The fact that they have so many now paths forward from this deal, literally immediately. Tomorrow, they could trade all that stuff for something else. That's why this is such a valuable trade for the Pacers, who are retooling, rebuilding, whatever word you want to use. This still allows them to do all that. They could be a cap space team this coming summer. They could still be an over the cap team that uses all these assets to grow as a rebuilding team with the new picks, with Rubio's contract, whatever they want to do. They could decide to sign and trade Rubio. They could use his spot to bring in a young player this season. They could even flip him again. They could flip the picks again. Whatever they want to do, they now have way more options and way more ammo to do it. And that is why I think this is a great trade for the Pacers, because LeVert provided them with what they needed at the time they got him. But this season and where the Pacers were headed, he was not providing them what they needed at all. And they just weren't good enough. And so his stats are good. He had a great run in December for this team. He had a good run in early January. He scored 42 points in his last performance with this team, the most Caris LeVerting performance of all time, taking 26 shots in a 7-point loss. He'll help the Cavs a ton, but this, I think, was without knowing the other offers that the Pacers had, and that's why grading trades is always a little hard, right? But without knowing what other offers the Pacers had, I think this is about what they should have been hoping for anyway, is something that gives them, obviously, the future assets that they want, and something that allows them to still consider more options in other trades that they make instead of limiting them themselves to something or another thing. Prospects versus being good versus draft picks, whatever. They still need to pick their direction, and they kind of have. They're clearly signaling that they're rebuilding, but they can still decide in what way they want to do that now. And I think that has a lot of value. So this trade grade is not complete. None of these things ever are, right, when they happen. Who they pick with the draft picks will define how good this is. What they do with Ricky Rubio could define how good this is. There's still a lot to determine here. But I think the Pacers did a very good job trading LeVert for what they did, and they have a lot of options moving forward. And I don't think his value is much higher than this, so I give the Pacers about an A or A minus. I mean, if I find out in the future that they had a better offer out there, sure, maybe you say something else, but you don't know what their goals or priorities are either. So all things considered, I think the Pacers did a pretty good job here, but will be incomplete, and we'll know more even by Thursday, right? Once we know their salary cap situation heading into next season, once we know who else was dealt, once we know what they decide to do with Rubio, this trade grade will be much more complete. Tentatively now, though, pretty good trade for the Pacers. If you have questions, if you think I said something stupid, which I do all the time, tweet at me at TEastNBA. If you think that you want more info on something, same kind of deal. I'll tweet the Pacers cap sheet tomorrow, but it'll be kind of pointless because it could change again dramatically in the next couple days. This podcast is at Locked On Pacers. Tweet out every episode there. Respond to people who have concerns or comments there as well. I'll try to use that account for more stuff in the future. That's at Locked On Pacers. Thank you guys so much for listening today. More to come on trades in the next couple days with some guests, one of which who used to host the show, one of which who used to host a different Pacers podcast. Lots of fun stuff coming up. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you then.